Oral questions by members.
Member for Kamloops South Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last month, the government purchased the Paul's Motor Inn to house the homeless and at-risk individuals here in Victoria. Cliff Lair owns Paul's Diner, and he rents the space for his diner within Paul's Motor Inn. Now, the announcement of the government's purchase came as a complete surprise to Cliff. There was no warning, there was no consultation. And so overnight, this organic diner that Cliff and his partners have worked so hard to build has gone up in smoke. If Cliff was standing here right now, this is the question that he would pose to the Minister of Housing, and I quote, "Our opportunity to operate a viable business was taken away from us the minute your government became our landlords. It's not fair that my staff and I should be made to suffer as a result of this decision. What are you going to do to fix this?" End quote.
Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing.
Mr. Speaker, and I think it's really important to recognize that we are in a COVID situation that requires quick movement, quick action to make sure that we have the opportunity for those who are most vulnerable in our communities to have the opportunity for quarantining and for a safe place to rest their heads, Honourable Speaker. And the opportunity to purchase this hotel, among other hotels, is part of a government response to make sure that we have the opportunity to house people who desperately need it.
Member Kamloops South Thompson on a supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the minister talks about collaboration a lot. In fact, in our estimates last week, she must have mentioned the word about 200 times. But apparently, collaboration doesn't extend to small businesses that are impacted by her decisions. The housing minister's decision has actually killed 20 jobs and has left Cliff and his partners heavily in debt. Crime has spiked on the property. No one wants to visit this area anymore. And there's really no path forward for this organic diner to resume its operations. Again, Cliff had this to say, and I quote, "So far, the only solution that's been offered for us is writing off $150,000 in renovations, killing 20 good local jobs, and giving up on our dream that we all worked so hard to achieve. If the government doesn't fix this, it will ruin us." End quote. So again, to the Minister of Housing, what is she going to do to make things right for Cliff and his partners?
Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And like I said before, as a government, our response is to help those who have been severely impacted by COVID. And as I said before in this House and in this chamber, is that we have moved very quickly to make sure that we have the opportunities for these folks. The hotel did come up for sale. I want to remind the member that it was up for sale. And so we purchased it so that we can do more with this property. And I want to point out, Honourable Speaker, that we actually had one of the local physicians, the addictions physician, who talked about how people are stabilizing, how it is making a difference for those who absolutely desperately need these homes and these supports.
Member Kamloops South Thompson on a second supplemental.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. A simple phone call, an attempt on the part of the minister, the minister's office, BC Housing, to reach out to this small business would have been, I think, the least that they could have done to give them a heads up as to this purchase. But apparently the minister seems quite disinterested in worrying about the impacts of her decisions on small businesses. Cliff owns 3 other restaurants and bakeries in Victoria, and rightfully so. He's worried about the exposure of this situation to his other operations. To quote Cliff, "If this government doesn't address our losses, we run the real risk of having to close our other locations, which will put another 35 local jobs and the families that depend them at risk." End quote. So again, to the Minister of Housing, the minister's decision has already killed 20 jobs and now risks putting dozens more out of work. What is she going to do to fix the situation so that Cliff and his partners don't lose everything?
Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, I want to assure the member that when we made these purchases, which happen confidentially because they are land purchases, I think that's important to recognize, we reach out to all of the tenants in all of our purchases and encourage them to continue operating their businesses, and we will certainly maintain their leases, and we certainly engage with them around next steps. I'm very proud of the fact that we have moved quickly to make sure that those who are most vulnerable have the opportunity to have a safe place to rest their head and get the supports they need so that they can make better life choices.
Member Richmond Queensborough.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Friday, the minister said that BC Housing is budgeting on continuing to receive lease revenue from the businesses located in recently purchased hotel sites. This just doesn't work for these businesses and not just for Paul's Diner as well. Local Victoria's Salon, all about Hue Hair Design, discovered through the media that their leased property located in the former Comfort Inn had been acquired as a shelter. Most of the salon's clients have cancelled their appointments after their business suffered water damage from a fire in one of the units shortly after they began moving people into the hotel. Why does BC Housing's business plan for these sites revolve around acquiring businesses and forcing them to continue operating out of locations where they feel unsafe?
Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, we also know that we've had some significant challenges because the previous government continued to ignore homeless people. They did that. Oh, look, listen to them now, Honourable Speaker. Now suddenly they're paying attention. They ignored a problem that was growing and growing and growing. And, Honourable Speaker, we took significant steps when we became government, and we're continuing to take significant steps. There are many who are very proud of the fact, and I'm very proud of the fact, that we moved hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people into stable housing, Honourable Chair. That, I think, is really significant for this government. It's significant for the people of British Columbia, and they can all be proud of that work.
Member Richmond Queensborough on a supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These businesses will not survive NDP policy. That's fact. The minister has been derelict in her duties. And let me give you an example. The salon's owner, Lindsay Price, says the first interaction she had with a representative of BC Housing was a construction worker she encountered boarding up her shop's window for, quote, safety reasons, end quote. Imagine that. The next day, a BC Housing representative tried to entice them to continue operating their business out of the now shelter. To quote Lindsay, "This has been the most unprofessional experience I've ever encountered in my years in business," end quote. The minister's actions is driving small business owners out of business, Mr. Speaker. What will she do to compensate them?
Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, you know what drives small business out of business? It's the fact that they continued to ignore homelessness as it was growing under their watch, Honourable Speaker. We're cleaning up their mess. We're going to continue doing what we need to do to house the most vulnerable, to bring in the supports that they need. Oh, listen to them, Honourable Speaker. They would much rather sow division in communities rather than bring communities together, build them up together so that we can actually make a change in people's lives.
House Leader, third party.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. The Water Sustainability Act was brought into force 4.5 years ago to ensure a sustainable supply of fresh, clean water that meets the needs of BC residents today and into the future. Under this Act, anyone using groundwater for anything other than household use is required to obtain a water license and pay nominal water fees and rentals. Licensing groundwater use establishes equity between surface water and groundwater users and gives certainty to licensees for their continued use and helps the government understand how much water is being used. However, since the Act came into effect in early 2016, only 4,000 applications have been received by the ministry, and there are an estimated 20,000 existing non-domestic groundwater users in BC. My question through you, Honourable Speaker, is to the Minister of Forest Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development. The deadline for applications is March 1st, 2022. At the current pace, your government will only receive applications from 25% of users, meaning that many will be legally required to stop diverting and using water and in many cases shut down their businesses on that day. What resources is his ministry using to assure there is an uptake in the licensing and protection of non-residential water users?
Minister of Forests, Lands, Natural Resources and Rural Development.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker, and thank you to the member for the important question around water use and groundwater use. Our ministry has taken many measures to reach out to those on wells and using groundwater to encourage them to register. We've made many efforts, and we're taking efforts through social media, through direct contact, through advertising campaigns. We've extended the deadlines and increased our performance as in getting direct contact, and pointing out that it's in the user's best interest to register their use. This becomes an important record for future applications on the same groundwater systems. And it also is encouraged by waiving the fees that will come into effect for those water users if they don't apply before the deadline. So we're taking it very seriously. We've extended the deadline because we realized the efforts within our ministry weren't getting the results that we wanted. And so we've adjusted and are reaching out to the users to encourage them to register before the deadline.
House Leader, third party on a supplemental.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I appreciate that the Minister recognises the importance of this. However, the trajectory for only having 25% of users registered by the deadline is not a positive one for the province or for certainty that business is going to need in order to know that users of non-residential users of water will be able to turn on their taps after this Act comes into full force. Equally worrying is the lack of progress on the submitted applications. Of the 4,000 submitted so far, fewer than 1,000 have been processed. So my question for you again, Honourable Speaker, is to the Minister of Forests, Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development. What is his exact plan to get this Act enacted? How many new staff have been applied to this, and what are the exact resources that have been put towards ensuring that this water licensing happens?
Minister of Forests, Lands, Natural Resources and Rural Development.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And again, thank you to the member. Water usage across the province is an incredibly important issue, especially as we see the impacts of climate change and generally more people accessing not just groundwater, but surface water as well for a variety of reasons. We have increased our allotment of staff on this topic. Again, as we became government, we realized in short order that the original deadline was not going to be met. And we've extended that deadline and used a number of means to reach out to the groundwater users. There's an estimated 20,000 existing non-domestic groundwater wells that are required to be licensed, and as the member points out, many have not taken advantage. And so our, as of April 23rd, 2020, about 20%, and that's approximately 4,000, as you pointed out, of the anticipated applications that's been received. So we have some work to do, no doubt about it. We'll be boosting up efforts to ensure people come into compliance and register their groundwater use. And again, I just want to emphasize, Honourable Speaker, that it's in the user's best interest to establish the use that they have of that groundwater and therefore protect their use into the future. Thank you.
Member for Langley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the issue of water licenses, of course, is only one piece that the Green Party House Leader has raised. There's a second piece, and the Minister alluded to it a moment ago, and that is that the registration of domestic wells is also lagging far behind. Mind you, Mr. Speaker, this is 3 years into this government's tenure. I want to know, at this point, 3 years in, why has the minister only just now seemed to come to the realization that he needs to add more staff to get this done?
Minister of Forests, Lands, Natural Resources and Rural Development.
Well, thank you, Honourable Speaker, and thank you again. I'm glad to see so many questions on an important topic in BC, and that's the domestic, the use of groundwater for domestic consumption. Since becoming government, as I said, we realized that the previous efforts of the past government that the member represented weren't good enough. And so we took measures right away to try to improve the registration of groundwater usage. When that became apparent quite quickly that we weren't going to be getting an uptake of registering groundwater wells, then we took measures immediately. We extended the deadline. We improved outreach, communication to the users of the groundwater, and in order to ensure that they understood the benefits. We're taking an approach that involves education, and that's what we plan on doing in order to get full compliance and compliance by the deadline. Thank you.
Member for Langley on a supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Water Sustainability Act provides government with new powers to control water usage in times of drought and scarcity. Government can take some really dramatic action, and wells registered for domestic use, of course, would be prioritized. But here's the risk. If domestic wells are not registered, they are at risk of losing their right to use water. We want to know what specific action the minister plans to take going forward in order to ensure that these rights to water use are protected, not the actions that they thought maybe they should take 3 years ago, but here you are, 3 years into a mandate, plenty of time to have seen this coming, and yet we're hearing the minister speak now about actions that are not specific and don't seem to involve dedicated staff.
Member of Forest Lands, Natural Resources and Rural Development.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And once again, we value water in this province to such a phenomenal degree. It's so important for all aspects of how we conduct ourselves. And that's why it's important for people with groundwater wells to, and I have a groundwater well, as a matter of fact, but people with groundwater wells to register their usage for non-domestic consumption. And so we are taking measures, and we have taken measures, and we do have dedicated staff working on this. We've taken ongoing measures, including presentations at conferences, including emails to stakeholders, including informational articles in trade publications and open houses. So a suite of tools, and it's a public education in order to get people to comply by the deadline, and that being March 1st, 2022. So we have still some time to make sure that we get that compliance rate as high as it can be.
Member Coquitlam Burke Mountain.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. British Columbians want to know what the term 24/7 wraparound support means. It's British Columbians know what the term 24/7 wraparound support means. It's physicians, nurse practitioners, clinical staff, and outreach workers who are on site and available when needed 24/7. But despite promises of 24/7 service, that's not what government is delivering to sites all around the Lower Mainland. Last Friday, the minister confirmed, quote, "There are no clinicians on site." That's a different level of service, but there is someone on site who will sit down and have a cup of tea and listen, end quote. Does the minister understand that a cup of tea will not adequately meet the complex and unique needs of this vulnerable population?
And to which minister, member? The question?
Minister of Housing.
I'm
Minister of Housing.
Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing.
Thank you
member.
very much, Mr. Speaker. It wasn't clear if it was to me or to the Minister of Mental Health and Addiction, so I wanted to get some clarity. So I want to point out to all the members, and what's interesting is I was listening to the quote, I'm thinking, well, that's a little bit out of context, Honourable Speaker, in terms of what we talked about on Friday. So let me correct the record here in the House so that all members can hear exactly what I talked about. What I talked about was the fact that we have very well-trained, very well-educated staff 24/7, some of whom will be nurses, nurse practitioners, physicians, as well as support workers, Honourable Speaker. And I think it's important for people to understand what a support worker is. And I have a job posting, actually, Honourable Speaker, that comes from one of the projects, a supportive housing project in Vancouver. And they have actually a job posting right now for the midnight to noon shift, Honourable Speaker. So that's sort of the overnight part. And I think that we can all agree that that's, I think, the part that the members are raising what I think is a divisive issue about. But I think it's important that British Columbians and the members opposite understand what that means when we're talking about a support worker. So in this case, Honourable Speaker, I want to point out to the members that this person, let me talk about their training for a moment, Honourable Speaker, because I think it's important. A minimum of 2 years post-secondary education in mental health and addictions and a minimum of 2 years experience in a similar setting with a mental health and addictions related agency. Extensive working knowledge of psychosocial rehabilitation approaches and services, including individual service plan development and implementation and life skills training. A solid background and knowledge of concurrent disorders with related work experience. 2 years experience working with people with mental illness or those at risk of homelessness, and a demonstrated commitment to promoting empowerment and individual and group advocacy. Honourable Speaker, these people are very well trained to do their jobs.
Member for Coquitlam Burke Mountain on a supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I just want to remind the minister that it was her quote on Friday afternoon that I am repeating here. Secondly, this is the third time that we've heard the minister describe the job description of very well qualified people, but that really is not the issue. Residents in Yaletown are frustrated with an increase of open drug use, needles in playgrounds, aggressive behavior, break-ins, and violence. When I asked about the 400% increase in crime, the minister dismissed it, telling me, quote, "That just means that people are making phone calls. And most often, it is not a crime. It's just a concern," end quote. Why is the minister dismissing the legitimate concerns being raised by residents and businesses about the increase in crime?
Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, first of all, I want to say that those 24/7 support workers, the ones that we all banged our pots and pans for all of those many days, those are the people that are being disrespected by the people opposite, Honourable Speaker. They're doing tremendous work, and to suggest that they're not qualified to support people, I think is disrespectful, Honourable Speaker. Secondly, Honourable Speaker, I want to say that we have done dozens of these supportive housing programs right around the province, Honourable Speaker, over the last number of years. We've housed thousands of people. And at the beginning, when we first bring these online, there is a bit of an unsettled time. And we know, we have seen calls go up to police requests because people are concerned. But what we've also done, Honourable Speaker, is we've seen from the evidence that actually crime doesn't go up. In fact, in the Marpole area, crime actually went down, Honourable Speaker, because we follow the trends, we follow what's going on. And Honourable Speaker, clearly the members opposite are not interested in bringing people together to house the most vulnerable. They are looking for opportunities to sow seeds of division, and I think that's very disappointing, Honourable Speaker.
Member North Vancouver Seymour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I would suggest that the minister go and visit downtown Vancouver, because simply moving people into hotels without proper on-site services solves nothing. And the NDP clearly don't have community buy-in there. I was on the conference call with Vancouver residents like Mike or Miles Mitchinson, and he told me, and I quote, "There's a tipping point where people go from being willing to put up with issues in their community to a point of boiling over," end quote. So again, to the Minister of Housing, will the minister finally listen to people like Miles and put together a proper program that includes real access to on-site services?
Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And like I said, all of our programs have on-site services. And again, I find it very disrespectful of the members to suggest somehow that the professionals that work there 24/7 are somehow not professionals. These are the people who have put their lives on the line during a COVID response to make sure that people were safe. I am sure all of these members were out on their porches banging their pots and pans. I know that I was, and I was thinking of these people who are working with the most vulnerable, making sure they were safe. And to suggest somehow that they're not professional, I think is very disrespectful of them, Honourable Speaker.
Member North Vancouver Seymour on a supplemental.
So, Mr. Speaker, what the minister doesn't understand is that we do respect these workers. The fact is, they're just not there all the time. Without the wraparound support, the NDP are simply warehousing people. Shockingly, in September 2017, when this minister was first appointed Minister of Housing, she said, when referring to the lack of services, and I quote, 8x8 rooms are not going to address homelessness, and it's not where people can get the services that they need so that they can become contributing members of society, end quote. That is the minister's words. When is this minister going to start providing real on-site wraparound services to the people that need it?
Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We started doing that back in 2017, Honourable Speaker, and I'm very proud of the fact that we started that program. The members referring to SROs, Honourable Speaker, those are 8x8 rooms. We're not doing that. That's not what we're providing in our supportive housing modular program. That's not at all what we're providing. In fact, people have their own washrooms, Honourable Speaker. The dignity of a washroom is what people now have access to. The dignity of 3 meals a day, Honourable Speaker, is what they have access to. They have the opportunity to receive the supports, the counseling, the medical services, and the medication services that they don't normally get under the previous government, Honourable Speaker. We have made significant progress, Honourable Speaker. Is there more to do? Absolutely, and I look forward to continuing to deliver for the people of this province.
Member for Kamloops North Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, it's not just Yaletown that is experiencing these situations. It's not just the Lower Mainland that is experiencing this. It's the same story in West Victoria Street in Kamloops. On Friday, the minister admitted that the 24/7 clinical wraparound supports and services that people rightly expect just aren't there. She has very clearly said that there are no clinicians on site and only someone to, quote, have a cup of tea, end quote. To the housing minister, the businesses and residents around the West Victoria Street corridor in Kamloops have had enough. When will she deliver a proper program with real access to on-site services?
Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing.
Honourable Speaker, it's so interesting to hear how things get taken out of context. We have really made some significant progress. In fact, even in the member's own writing. In fact, there was an editorial around Kamloops that said, and I quote at the end of the editorial, we are seeing the fruits of that labour, meaning our labour, now, and will continue to witness serious progress on the issue. The community of Kamloops is very pleased to see the progress that we are making in their community, and we are going to continue doing it, Honourable Speaker, because people need the dignity of a home. They need supports 24/7 that we provide, and access to clinical services when they need them.
Member Kamloops North Thompson on a supplemental.
Well, Mr. Speaker, maybe the minister could recite from the newspapers in Kamloops about the attack on the security guard that was hired as a result of what was going on in the West Victoria Street corridor. The 71-year-old retired gentleman that was doing a side job who got attacked and put in hospital with charges pending now against the person that attacked him. That was the minister's response when the community started to rise up on the issues. The issues and concerns we're raising today are real. They're from the community, Mr. Speaker. They're what we're hearing from our own constituents, and the minister is dismissing them out of hand by saying we're trying to be divisive. We're simply bringing forward what people are calling for, and what they're calling for is what the minister promised with her multiple different times that she has talked about 24/7 supports. So again, when is the minister going to provide on-site proper supports and services that the communities were led to believe by this minister they would be getting?
Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing.
Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker. We have 24/7 supports for people on site. I think what the members keep referring to is they would prefer to go back to the old days when we institutionalized people. Because that's what they're describing, Honourable Speaker, and it's not how we operate. And I know that they're moaning and groaning over there, Honourable Speaker, but they know full well that what we've been doing is housing people and giving them the supports. The data says that housing first works, Honourable Speaker, and I prefer to follow the science. I think that's really what's critical. It's what British Columbians expect of us.
Member Parksville-Qualicum.
Mr. Speaker, back in March, the legislature approved $5 billion for economic recovery, and yet here we are 16 weeks later, and not a dime of that money has been spent on a tourism industry that's in crisis. Other provinces have a plan, and they're spending money on tourism recovery, but not here in British Columbia. In fact, the Minister of Tourism said on Friday, I quote, "What we're going to do is continue listening and developing a plan," end quote. So to the Minister of Tourism, when will she actually present a recovery plan that includes and outlines investments?
Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. We did very thoroughly talk about this on Friday, and as I said to the member, we've done a number of, provided a number of supports for the tourism industry to date, such as the $10 million we provided to the CDMOs so that they are able to welcome visitors all across the province now that we're in phase 3 of our recovery. So what the member and I talked about on Friday was very clear. We've worked closely with the sector. We've been able to provide, some pieces of relief to date to a sector that's been extremely hard hit by the COVID pandemic, and we're going to keep working with the sector as we work towards recovery. There's an ongoing process going on. We're out talking to sectors all across the province. We're talking to all British Columbians to see what they want British Columbia to look like and move towards in recovery. And I'm going to keep working very closely with the tourism sector to address their needs. Thank you.
Members, the bell ends question period.